Great. I think we've got a few more people here, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending Tech Tuesday. Today, we're going to be covering kind of a hot button topic, something that's been in the news recently at least, ChatGPT and large language models, or LLMs. Before we get started here today, though, I do have a bit of housekeeping to just bring up real quick. Uh, First, if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the questions box. Especially with a complex topic like this one, I may not answer right away. I'll probably answer your question here at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to type in questions as they pop up. If it's relevant, I'll probably address it in the moment. And if it's more something I think I can address later down the line, I'll probably do that. Don't worry though, I will answer all questions, or if I feel that I can't answer a question, I'll definitely do some research and get back to you. Also, if you feel that you don't want to ask a question in this webinar, but you do have something you'd like to know more about, please feel free to reach out to me directly. My number is displayed on the screen, as well as my email address. Additionally, don't forget, you can follow us on social media and subscribe to our weekly Monday Minute newsletter for the latest Cornerstone carrier and industry updates. Also, with Cornerstone's agency services program, you're the pilot of your business and we're your flight crew. As a Cornerstone broker, you have access to expert services from our agency services program that can help you with business outside of your scope and planning for the future. We will create a customized plan for you based on your specific needs to ensure that you, your business, and your family are fully covered. Contact your Cornerstone representative for more information. And lastly, before we get into it, don't forget to sign up for AGB if you haven't yet. AGB is our new and improved broker portal, and it's available for all Cornerstone broker partners as your one-stop shop to manage your book of business through Cornerstone. From carrier and client information to commission schedules, if you have any questions about the new platform and your access, please feel free to reach out to the broker advisor team or the AGB support team directly at www.crnstone.com/AGB, or just send an email to agbsupport@crnstone.com. For some reason, we've been having a bit of an issue with the link on the website, so you might want to just email that directly to that address. So that being said, let's get into the topic at hand today, which is what are ChatGPT and LLMs, or large language models. And before we get started more talking specifically about large language models, I want to kind of address an elephant in the room. I think everyone has an idea of what an AI is, be it something from like the Terminator movies, or if you're a big sci-fi fan, maybe HAL 9000. Maybe you watch Westworld on HBO and you know more about the Westworld dolls. Or maybe you have something, an idea of AI that's a little bit more down to earth, self-driving cars. Now, self-driving cars are technically AI. They do kind of technically think for themselves, but it's a little more complicated than that, and we're going to get into that here in a moment. That being said, where on this scale do you think humanity really is, and what do you think I'm referring to when I say AI? Because I guarantee you it's none of the top three options. Before we get even deeper into this topic, I also want to add a disclaimer. I'm a commission and compensation specialist with technical kind of focus and a bachelor's degree in marketing and business administration, not an AI computer scientist. What I'm going to say here is going to be general, and I'm not a full expert in this field, but it's important to talk about. And I think it's important that if you're going to use something like this, you have a general understanding of how things work and why they work. A good example of this is, driving a car. If you have a license to drive a car, then you know how to operate it, the rules of the road. You're able to drive, here in America. That being said, unless you're a mechanic, you might only know your car's general maintenance needs and that the engine makes it go. You know that a car making a noise, doesn't make sense. You should probably take it into a mechanic who knows more about how the car works under the hood. Maybe they're going to do some sort of diagnostics and repair. Realistically, though, you probably want to know a little bit more than that in real life if you're a driver. Let's use that noise example I mentioned. If your car's making a screeching noise and it's coming from the wheel well, a good driver would probably take that into the mechanic. But let's say the mechanic says, oh, you need to replace your full engine to fix this screeching noise. Your car could explode if you don't do this. You definitely haven't been taking care of anything. That probably isn't correct. I know that if, I heard screeching from my wheel well and my mechanic says I need to replace an engine, I'd probably want a second opinion. You could end up spending a lot of money just to not even fix the real issue. As a consumer, that's kind of the level of familiarity I'm going to try to get you with AI over the next two Tech Tuesdays. While I'm not trying to make you an expert, you should at least walk away with a better understanding of what AI like ChatGPT may be useful for, when to be skeptical, and we're really going to focus on these three questions I have listed here. First, being how it works generally, and what makes GPT different from other AI. What really is AI? How does it really operate under the hood, generally speaking? And what makes a large language model different from something like a chatbot or an Amazon return kind of walkthrough? We're going to get deeper into the ways that current iteration of AI are actively being used and what you may expect to see soon in the next webinar as well. But if you don't care how it works, that's fine. Just remember my example above. It's always a good idea to at least have a general understanding of what this thing's actually doing. That being said, what is AI? Well, the field of AI is just teaching machines to think through problems versus doing math. At its core, AI really is what the name suggests, artificial intelligence. But what really is intelligence? If you talk to 10 different people, I'm willing to bet you'd get 10 different answers. It just brings up a good question. So when we say AI, what does that really mean? What is ChatGPT, so to speak? Well, if you're a fan of sci-fi like me, there are probably three different fields of AI, at least general categories. The first is narrow AI, and this is kind of the most ubiquitous form of AI in use today. It's very narrow, and it focuses generally on one task. A good example of ways that it's being used now is identifying if a cow is sick on a farm. That I know seems probably out of nowhere, but a company called Plain Sight is doing just that. It uses AI to kind of scan the faces of a lot of different cattle and see, oh, well, this one, is just showing signs of looking a little under the weather. Maybe you might want to, take this cow to a doctor or, maybe just change its feed, things like that. Now, Plainsight is actually a very interesting company, and they're doing a lot more work than just that. I'd highly recommend looking them up if you're interested in just generally where AI is today, but I digress. Some more examples of narrow AI that are in use today would be theft and fraud detection at banks, text word suggestion on your phone. You know how if you're typing out a text, it has that little bar above your keyboard that says what the next word it's suggesting is. That's something that AI is probably using. Also, you can use it to at least direct kind of investigation or research. I know that I've used it at least once or twice to help look things up just for this presentation, just to give myself a starting point. Now, that being said, it might also be in use today to get you into the right place in a phone tree, although those are sometimes called chatbots. And we'll get more into the difference between those and real narrow AI shortly. The next step on our list, however, is general AI. And that's kind of the next step that a lot of research groups are working towards. ChatGPT kind of fits almost into this category. Most AI are designed to do one thing very, very well. That's just due to the nature of how it's trained. But researchers are working on making it more accessible for general audiences and more applicable to several varieties of tasks. ChatGPT is really the first big step in that direction, but it's not truly there yet. It's really more focused on conversation. And the goal of OpenAI, at least that's the nonprofit that's kind of hosting ChatGPT, is to make ChatGPT this kind of AI. Now, the final step on our rung would be strong AI. And I think this is what everyone thinks of when they say AI. It can do everything generally better or faster than humans. It has no built-in restrictions, and it can do pretty much anything autonomously. Think like Data from Star Trek or the droids in Star Wars. We're still very, very far from that, and I don't think it's something that we'll see at the very least in the next 10 to 20 years. But it's something that people are working toward, and this step toward general AI is kind of the first real leap we're taking in that general direction. So moving forward, just know that when I talk about AI, I'm referring within the bounds of narrow and general AI. So we're not talking data level kinds of, autonomous robots, but we are talking generally robots that are trained to kind of think through tasks. At its core, though, an AI isn't directly thinking. It's modeling thinking, but it's not really thinking. An AI really is just a function as part of an overall piece of software. A function is just a small chunk of a program that takes variables, processes them, and spits them back out for the general program to use as a whole. That's what makes a function a function. Now, what makes AI different than a lot of other functions is the way it uses its inputs. So a typical function, and I'm just have an example on the screen there, is something kind of expressed algebraically, like x times 3.5 plus 2 equals y. Y would be our output in this case. If you put 1 into this, it'll take 1, multiply it by 3.5 to give you 3.5, add 2 to that, your answer is 5.5. What makes AI unique, however, is that it doesn't actually do math or do any of that to give an output back into the overall program. What it does instead is try to reduce error. It's not looking to give you any one specific answer. It's just trying to make sure that the answer makes sense or it makes more sense than it already did. Basically, instead of doing math to find the direct answer, it uses a system of weights and preferences to make these decisions. A good example is kind of the error reduction one that I have on screen. An AI, through its training, will be given a lot of different prompts. Let's say I'm trying to get the AI to answer the problem 1 plus 1 equals 2 correctly. The first time I give it 1 plus 1, it might say, oh, it's equals 3. Clearly that's wrong. I would tell it no, and it would run the program again. Then I would say, okay, what's 1 plus 1? It says 5. No, that's also incorrect. And it would go back, reevaluate, change its weights and measures, and then it says, okay, well, 1 plus 1 is probably equal to 2. And I'll go, yes, that is correct. That's definitely what I was looking for. Then I run it again, and it might actually be wrong again. It might say, oh, well, 1 plus 1 is equal to 6. And I would say, no, that's not right. And we just kind of continue this process over and over and over again until it gives me an answer that actually makes sense. This process is called training, and it's the real difference between something like a program that's generally ubiquitous and in use today and AI. Now, another example is a web search. This might actually pertain more to your and I's lives more directly. Let's say an AI is trying to figure out what restaurants from a list are Italian restaurants. Now, a normal program might run through the list, access the internet, and then look for any restaurant tagged by Google as being Italian, and then present you with that list. And you can look through it and say, okay, well, all of these look like generally good Italian restaurants. AI, on the other hand, will do not that. It will take a large list of restaurant names from its training data and painstakingly, through trial and error, figure out what restaurants are Italian based on a lot of different weights or inputs. Now, these weights could be things like the name of the restaurant. It could be something like what color are the logos of the restaurant? How is the menu of the restaurant arranged on the page, et cetera, et cetera. It takes all of these kinds of data points, I guess I'd say, and assembles them together to give it an idea of what makes an Italian restaurant Italian. Then, if you prompt it, hey, is this restaurant Italian? It'll be able to tell you, yes, that restaurant is Italian, or no, that restaurant is not Italian. But the key here is it doesn't actually know what Italian is. All it knows is generally what makes up an Italian restaurant. And it might be right, it might be wrong. But the process of trying to eliminate that error is through training. A deep learning AI, which is what ChatGPT is, consists of two different parts that actually make that happen: a neural network or model and data sets. And while it's very indirect compared to just pulling up a list off Google and saying, oh, these are all tagged as Italian, it does have its advantages. Specifically, it means that when you're using an AI like this, it's not going to give you canned responses. It's not going to, just have a list of 30 or so different things that it will always say. Instead, it's going to take whatever you give it, process it, and then spit you out an answer that's completely unique. Now, that unique answer is based on its training data, but you're not going to get the same answer every single time. And I digress. What I'm saying is it's very different than just a set algebraic function. That being said, let's break apart those two things that make up this AI a little bit more. First, let's talk about models. Models are actually the core function that makes up an AI. For instance, kind of going back to our example before, a function is just a piece of a program. The piece of the program that is the AI is the model. That would be ChatGPT. GPT stands for General Transforming Architecture, and that's the model that the AI is following. Now, these models are called neural networks because they're based on scientific models of the human brain. The weights and conditions are equivalent to neurons, and the path that the AI takes as it goes from weight to weight to weight to weight to weight to kind of determine its answer is very similar to how humans think. The path that like a neuron firing takes through your brain is reinforced over time, and that same kind of path that it takes through to determine an answer to a problem in AI is called bias. That bias interacts with weights to determine what the output of the AI is going to be, and that's formed over training. A model overall is both the weights and the bias as a whole. To kind of re-summarize that, it's easy to think of this as kind of a thought or an idea. A thought can be represented as the path a signal takes from, a neuron in your brain all the way through your brain until it kind of stops firing. That's what we call a thought in biology, but it's the same kind of thing that AI are doing to actually find your answer. If you ask it a question, it'll look at your question and then run that through its own system of weights and measures to determine what it's going to answer you with. Simulations of this process are what a large language model AI are based on. And it's what an AI that's being trained by a researcher is trying to reinforce. It's trying to tell it, hey, adjust these weights to get more accurate information. It's the key difference between something like ChatGPT and Clippy, if you remember Clippy. Clippy was a Microsoft assistant that was actually used as part of the Microsoft Word program, and it was supposed to answer things that users might want to know about that program in an interactive way. Now, all its answers were canned. It was going to direct you to one thing or another thing based on keywords that you gave it. So if I said, Clippy, I need to find where, italics are in the menu, it would key in on the word menu and walk me through all of the menu. Now, if you gave that same kind of prompt to an AI instead of Clippy, you might say, hey, I'm trying to find italics. Where is that in the menu? It would say italics, menu, and say, okay, within that menu, here are the italics. Now, that being said, that's kind of the key difference, and it's kind of where it is as a whole. I do have two questions that I'm going to answer real quick. The first being, are we able to view this webinar on the Cornerstone website? Yes, you're absolutely able to view that on the tech website. We're almost through the tech, like deep tech part of this, so bear with me here in a second. The next webinar is really going to focus more on the general information and how AI is in use right now. So that may be more helpful to you if you're interested in that. Also, I just want to say that if you're interested in kind of where this is going, please bear with me through the rest of this. Like I said, you need to kind of understand what it's doing in order to understand how it's answering, and it's kind of useful in my opinion. So that being said, what is a large language model? It's an initial neural network used to train AI program based on text inputs. The key difference here is the more weights and the more parameters, hopefully you get a better AI. The problem with that is it also has a higher likelihood of getting things wrong. ChatGPT was trained on most of the human text that it could find up to the end of 2021. So that could be scans of books, that could be things that were just open on the internet, it could be anything. It uses those answers and that data set to respond to things. And it has over 117 million different weights that it actually applies to this kind of stuff. So when you ask an AI a question, it doesn't actually look through that entire library of human knowledge and give you a reply. It uses all the data that it was trained on to form those 117 million weights to get you an answer, and then generates its answer based on its training. Its data set's really large, so right now the goal is to try to reduce error, which is kind of the biggest problem. Another problem with it is, how does it work? The phrase work is really a strong one in this case, given what I've said to you so far. Strictly speaking, it doesn't work. It doesn't follow a formula to give you a standard answer. It has a ton of different inputs, and it can generate outputs kind of like a layman like me wouldn't think of as math. And that's what makes it powerful, but also kind of is a problem. Initial inputs follow the neural network's connections that it's made, and it modifies those weights to create an output. Remember, it has over 117 million of these things. So it also adds in a large element of randomness to its replies. And it's consistently trying to improve its clarity and accuracy of communication. So it's constantly training and constantly updating those responses. This is why if you ask an AI programmer, what an AI spit out for a particular answer and why it said that, they're not going to be able to point to one thing to tell you that. It's not going to be able to be shown step by step how it's arriving at its conclusion, because it's going through over 117 million different processes to actually analyze what you're asking it. An AI researcher's response to a pretty common question then, kind of in reply to that, is why don't we understand how neural networks work? And I actually really like this reply, so I have it on screen. Now, I also have this handout as, this presentation attached as a handout. So if you're curious and reading this a bit more in full, feel free to download it and read through. I think it's a great answer. But the general point that he's trying to make here is we know the process, we know the simulation, we know how it's, thinking, but we aren't going to be able to tell you why it said one specific thing because of that process. So while scientists know how it's thinking through things, they're not going to be able to tell you why it said one thing or another. Which arrives at the issues with AI as a whole right now. First off, I want to say there have been actual cases where important mistakes have been made using AI, and there are going to be more than likely, based on how AI is getting used today. The data it presents will be presented as very correct, and it'll be very convincing, but it won't know what it's saying, and it won't know exactly if it is correct. These situations where it spits out incorrect information or just generally very confusing information or incorrect information have been dubbed hallucinations by the AI research community. Whatever you type into an AI field, it might not give you a right response, and that's something to be aware of. Remember my example earlier, how it was trained, with 1 + 1 = 5 or 6 or 3. No, it's 2. There have been instances where ChatGPT has been convinced that 1 + 1 does equal 3. So if you're going to use AI, I wouldn't recommend using it for math. Also, it's not actually doing math calculations, it's running it through its language software. So it might know, well, the answer to this question that I was trained on repeatedly, 1 + 1 is always equal to 2, and it'll give you the correct answer for that, but it's not actually doing the math. It makes me concerned when people, type in large equations into it and say, what's the answer, versus just typing it into a calculator. Also, it's very expensive to do this kind of thing. It's not really in reach for someone to just generate their own version of ChatGPT. ChatGPT and OpenAI costs about $700,000 a day to run. That was provided by Business Insider. There's also no direct use case that was envisioned when AI or OpenAI started this. So it's not like people know exactly what it's going to be used for. It's not like people know where it's going to plug in. Kind of heralding back to your question earlier, Lucy, you asked, how is this going to affect agents, and are agents going to be replaced by AI? Probably not in the first 5 years or so. And that's kind of why. it doesn't really know why it's replying. It just knows its own responses that have been generated through its own thoughts. So I could tell you that, your premium is going to be this and your deductible is going to be that. But an AI wouldn't know what those things are, and it would maybe have context for, how it replies for what those things are, but it doesn't really know what they are. And that's kind of the general problem with AI as a whole right now. I don't think agents are going to be replaced anytime soon with this kind of thing. It is something to be aware of and something to know the strengths and weaknesses of if you're going to use it directly. Now, that being said, also please genuinely proceed with caution with this. AIs are known to hallucinate regularly and provide incorrect information. The data that ChatGPT on specifically is what I'm referring to in point 1 here is not up to date. It stopped in 2021 at the very end of the year. That's where its training data was. Now, it trained on this for an equivalent of 300 years using computer witchcraft, basically. But remember, it still just knows up to 2021. So it's hard to directly say if it has any real, information that's relevant to today in 2023. Some data is scraped from the internet. It does take answers that, users type into account, which is something I want to point out. But that data is limited. So it might be able to answer you, well, I know today's date because someone asked me for today's date and told me what it was. It'll reply, today is this day, but it doesn't actually check online to see what day it is. That specific example, I think, is actually taken online and it's fed into the AI daily. But that's kind of my point. It's not actively searching the internet, at least ChatGPT isn't. Another issue to think about is HIPAA requirements and possible liabilities for your company. I read this, so take it what it is, but I've heard that Google is actually recommending that its employees not use its own bot, Bard AI, to actually do code. And the reason for that is when you type in an answer or a question into ChatGPT or any AI really, and it generates an answer, it's taking that data to get trained on again. So anything that you type into it, it's going to save, it's going to store, and it's going to run it through itself to give better answers in the future. If you type, say, a social security number in there, tag it to a person's name, well, guess what? That third party now has access to the specific, social number for that specific name. So that's something to be aware of. Premium ChatGPT users have the ability to integrate it with third-party applications. And one of these kind of integrates it into Excel. So before you use that, if you do have access to Premium ChatGPT, you might want to make sure that you're actually giving it just general data. You don't want to have anyone's names linked to socials. Otherwise, you're literally giving OpenAI direct access to someone's personal information. Now, that being said, you are able to store something like that on a third-party server. This would be something like Dropbox, but you have to sign a business agreement. And that might be necessary if you're going to utilize AI as an insurance agent. We just don't know. It hasn't been tested yet. Also, one other thing to make sure you know before we move forward, there is no official mobile app on Android for ChatGPT. Now, there is one on iPhone, but you want to make sure when you're downloading it that you verify that the publisher is OpenAI. If it's not OpenAI, you're using someone else and they're just tunneling into that service, or they're not even giving you ChatGPT. So it's something you want to make sure that you have a handle on before you really make use of it. It's something that I get concerned about regularly, actually. Now, as far as how damaging the hallucinations go, I just want to mention something that you might have heard in the news. If you've heard of Stephen Schwartz, it's something I'd look up. He's a lawyer, and he used ChatGPT to do some research on a case he was working on airline liability. He asked ChatGPT for some case suggestions. It gave him a bunch of case suggestions, and he just copy-pasted it right into his work. He didn't double-check the AI. He did ask it if they were real cases, and the AI responded with, yes, they are. Very confident. But when he, submitted his work and started making his oral arguments on the case, they did more research. The opposing counsel, looked at the cases and found out that those cases are absolutely not real. They're 100% fake, and they were just randomly generated by the AI's language model. As a result, he is now facing consequences. He's actually on trial for sanctions right now. I wasn't able to find the results. The decision probably hasn't been rendered yet. The sanction case was only heard on June 8th, but it's something to keep in mind. Another point is that you just want to make really sure that you know what you're feeding it. If you give it a question and it's not correct, don't just copy paste. You have to be aware of what you're thinking about when you're using it. That being said, I do see some possible uses for AI moving forward. Another good idea might be email communication personalization. Let's say you're trying to send out a mass mailer and you're not sure how to word something. Something like ChatGPT might actually be really useful for, helping guide how you're phrasing sentences or what you're trying to do here. I said earlier that Google is saying don't use my AI to do your code, but really that's more for things that are like going to be copyrighted in the future. You don't want your trade secrets getting out onto the open internet for anyone to use. So if you're new to, coding and you're trying to learn something new, it might be useful to help you with that. It can also do things like create, workout guides for you if you're trying to, reach a goal. And it's got a lot of data that it generates replies on. Might be useful, might not. You just got to be, kind of cautious about what you're asking it and how to take its advice. Take everything with a grain of salt. Another good idea might be using creative writing and prompting. A friend of mine has a, lovely daughter. She's about 8, but every night she asks, Dad, can you tell me a bedtime story? He's kind of at his wit's end. He asked me for like 5 or 6, quick short stories, and I recommend using ChatGPT. I asked it the other day to generate some different stories just to tell her to go to bed, and it generated 5, 3-paragraph stories in a fraction of a second. It's really wonderful. So something like that might be useful. And now that being said, there are 3 general options for open conversational AI right now. And I kind of want to mention them before we, get too deep into some of our upcoming webinars. This is the last thing I'll mention on today. There's ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is the most popular. It's a general conversational model, and it's used to just kind of generate random replies. Well, random with context. It's helpful for talking through problems, and it's very helpful as well for just kind of working things out in your head. It's useful for coding, and it's useful for all the examples that I gave before. It's the most popular AI for a reason. It has very good context. That being said, you want to be aware of what version you're using. People who pay into ChatGPT have access to, well, pretty much all of it in its current form. But people who don't and people who use the free version, they don't. They have access to like the last gen model or the model before that. So you want to make sure what you're using is the most up-to-date version if you're going to use it in a professional setting. Probably want to use the paid option. There's also Bing AI, which uses the exact same model as ChatGPT, just reskinned and trained on some general different data sets. It's also open to the general internet at large, so it does have more context for more up-to-date answers, but there have been a lot more issues reported with it than ChatGPT. A lot of the responses say that it's either too emotional in its replies, takes things too personally, and kind of escalates conflict. And some people have even said it acts bipolar. So be careful if you're getting, too direct in your replies with it, getting a little emotional. Then the last one is Bard AI, Google Bard. It uses a Lambda instead of LLM, which is just a different training model. So things to focus on. Now, it also is focused more on internet extraction. So if you ask it a question, it won't necessarily respond to you with words always. Sometimes it'll respond to you with words and some links. So it might be more useful for research purposes rather than just general conversation and, structuring. But just, be aware of your options. Now, that being said, we do have some upcoming webinars I wanted to mention as well. Like I said, my next webinar is actually going to be a Tech Thursday instead of a Tech Tuesday because of the holiday. It's going to be on July 6th, and we're going to answer more specifically what kind of things it might be used for directly in insurance that, it's going to get used for now, and how people are taking advantage of tools just like it in a lot of other fields too. There'll also be a Q&A that I'm going to get into now. I have a lot of questions in chat that I'm going to answer here in a second that might be relevant. Also, I want to mention that on June 21st, we're having an individual corner that's on CareSource ACA product review. And we're also going to begin our summer CE series or continue it with things to think about when transferring a case with a principal. That'll be on June 22nd at 10 a.m. So let's get into some of these questions first. Looking through, let's go with this one. Can you use AI to create a social media bot? Technically, you can give it you can ask it questions to kind of help along with the process. You can even ask it how to create one, and it might actually give you an answer that's pretty dang good. You might be able to make use of it, but it might also have problems. Like I said before, you might want to troubleshoot it, make sure you know exactly what you're doing with it. ChatGPT is looking to integrate it into answers and replies for different things, but it's very speculative right now. It's not really going to be able to give you specific answers to specific industry as of yet. It might be something that OpenAI you'd want to talk to work about with, but if you're just trying to design your own bot to reply to things online, then yeah, it absolutely can help with the design portion of that. It might give you answers on how you would integrate it. It might give you some sample code in maybe C# or HTML. But unless you really know what that code means, you might not want to do that. It might be doing a lot more than you realize it's doing, so just be careful. Another good question here is, can we assume that AI will know about compliance requirements when used for marketing? Absolutely not. It does not know anything about requirements for compliance. All it knows is the data that it was fed, and it was fed probably some compliance requirements. That's part of general textbook human knowledge for a long time. But remember, it was only trained up to 2021, the very end of 2021. So any sort of compliance or any sort of requirement that's changed since then, there's no guarantee that it'll take that into account at all. So be careful. Oh, here's another good comment. Intelligence is only as good as the input to it, just like a computer program has always been. If there's bad information, it can be easily distributed. A little scary. Absolutely correct. It scares me too. Actually, there was a YouTube video I was watching the other day that kind of talked about this. AI will give you information even if it's wrong, and it'll act like it's really right. So it's something to be aware of, and it's generally going to kind of mess with our information landscape. There's almost going to be no way, if it really gets connected to the internet and used ubiquitously, to know if information is really true or if it's just said by someone randomly. That being said, it could also literally be said by someone randomly on Twitter. So, put as much stock into it as you would anyone replying to anything online. You might be pointing in the right direction, but you might want to also do a little bit of research on your own. Here's another good one. What do you think of Bard? Is it as good as ChatGPT? Well, I think they're good for different things. ChatGPT is really useful for conversation and for talking through things. It could be very useful for something like that. And Bard might be really useful for research. Remember, Bard is connected to Google directly. It's not, completely cut off from the internet like ChatGPT is. So where Bard might be a more helpful research assistant, and you might be able to, get better answers from a research perspective from Bard, you might get better answers for just conversation and general text creation from ChatGPT. So, different tool for different intent. Here's another one. Is it possible to accidentally plagiarize when you use AI for content creation? Do you get the same answers from the same questions? So you don't get the same answers from the same questions. It's going to maybe give you a generally similar answer, but every time you type a prompt into ChatGPT, you're probably going to get a different reply. It, like I said, uses that neural network that it has to kind of think through problems every single time, and those are updated daily. Those weights and measures change, and actually, as it generates answers, it injects an element of randomness into it. So every answer you get from ChatGPT, even though it may be saying the same thing, will look different. It absolutely is possible to plagiarize using ChatGPT. It might accidentally spit out an entire essay from its training, so be careful with it. Remember to run it through a plagiarism filter, or just generally search what it's got and make sure that it's giving you correct information. By the way, it's the same kind of thing with these image generating AI. 9 times out of 10, it'll give you something that is absolutely not plagiarism. It's probably generated, completely uniquely and different from another picture. But when you get an answer from it, run it back through the internet. Make sure that you don't get the same, image that you just generated. So be careful with it. A lot of this plagiarism stuff hasn't really been tried before. So even if, it isn't going to give you something that's plagiarism, you really don't know. Could it be useful from a sales training perspective for new salesmen? Maybe. It depends on what you're trying to do with it. If you're trying to use something like ChatGPT to maybe get a sale or to train them how to talk to people, it could probably be used for that. It's just very iffy. I would maybe use it to do like a training model, or maybe help generate some training questions and a training scenario, but I might not use it for the actual training itself right now. It's just too iffy about what kind of reply you'll get. That being said, funnily enough, it might actually be a good idea to use Bing's AI for that, because it'll get really emotional at things. So if you're trying to train someone with how to reply to, continually escalating situations, it might be useful, it might not. It just depends on what you're trying to get. Okay, here's another similar compliance question. Would ChatGPT have an understanding of SEO when writing content for a website? Probably not. It might take that into account. Another time it might not. It's really a shot in the dark. You really just don't know at this point. Could I use AI to create display ads for me? Yes, absolutely. You definitely can do that. It's actually something that I'd recommend doing if you're looking for a starting point to give a graphic artist. But it's not something that I'd use directly. I'd probably run it through some other image editing and send it off to a graphic artist to maybe tweak and edit personally. But if you don't have any editing skills, don't have any ability to, actually go out and get a graphic artist to do something, yeah, you can probably create an AI to, generate background images and then type over it in Microsoft Paint to create an ad. So it's possible. As far as the disclaimers go, though, I personally would type those myself. You might want to, run it through just to double check some legalese, but if you're writing an ad that has to, 100% be compliant with technical kinds of things or with law, I personally wouldn't use AI. I would write those myself or go to a lawyer. One final comment in my questions that I see here: the internet is not always accurate, and we sometimes lose sight of that. Absolutely correct. It's always important to double check your work and make sure that the source you're using actually makes sense. That's something that I actually did for this presentation, and it's something that a lot of people lose sight of. A lot of answers, generally, you get something online and you just kind of take it for its word, but that's not always the best. You want to make sure you're doing research and double checking answers you get. Otherwise, you're probably going to get taken for a ride, which is kind of the whole point of this presentation. So just something to be careful about. Like I said before, we have those webinars coming up, and I hope you had an excellent Tech Tuesday. Please be sure to reach out if you have any other questions about this. I'm putting up my contact information on the screen right now. Sorry, new computer. Let me swap that view. There we go. If you have any questions, please feel free to call me. I'm happy to chat about this, or just send me an email. If you're sending an email, make sure that you include Tech Tuesday in your header, and it'll get directed appropriately. If you don't, it'll just go to my general inbox, and I'll probably get to it eventually, but it'll be behind everything else. So, please feel free to reach out. As always, I hope you learned something new, and have a great Tech Tuesday.